First off, thanks for joining us. This is part of our agency support webinars that we run at Pimento for agencies and consultants in the independent sector. Huge welcome if you're new to Pimento. We've got quite a few of our HR friends today on the call who work within the agencies that we work with. So it's good to have you with us. You may not be familiar with Pimento, or at least you may not be on many of the calls. So it's great for you to hop along. This is part of a series I'm going to run across the year, really in support of independent agencies and a broad aspect of different activities that we provide and different key questions that agencies raise with us. For those that don't know me, my name is Stephen Knight. I'm the CEO of Pimento, and Pimento is in its 20th year. Can't believe it. How time flies when you're having fun, eh? So what we're going to do is basically introduce you to the panel who've joined us. I'm very fortunate to have an august panel with us today. We have Heidi Wadsworth from Reality HR, who are Pimento members, Alistair MacArthur from Herrington Carmichael, from the world of lawyers, and Peter Baker from a recruitment business that specialises in the marketing and in the communications and agency world. We are Adam. For those that don't know Heidi, I mean, she's been on lots of calls. We've been doing this together since COVID, I think. She's the head of learning and development at Reality HR, and she leads a team of expert trainers, ensuring every session is tailored, insightful, and impactful. With a diverse background in hospitality, retail, marketing, and manufacturing, Heidi brings practical, real-world experience to her training, making it highly relevant and engaging. She also works very closely with her team to customize programs to meet client-specific needs. So if you are looking for training in this space or any other space, I would suggest you reach out to Reality HR. We will, by the way, share a copy of the presentation with you after today's call, along with the contacts from the speakers. Alistair is an experienced employment lawyer with particular expertise in advising on dealing with recruitment practices, terms and conditions of employment, discrimination and harassment, termination of contracts and dismissals, the enforcement of post-termination obligations, transfer of undertakings on acquisitions and disposal of businesses, restructuring and redundancies. And finally, David is a director and part owner of executive search and selection consultancy. We are Adam, who are been in business actually the same length as Pimento, 18 years, helping businesses at various stages of their growth journey, identifying and helping to hire the very best marketing, commercial, HR and finance talent. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to tee up the conversation with some slides to really give you background to all of the changes that have taken place, some of which are yet to be fully implemented, others have already been implemented. But the idea is basically to go through the major ones, and then we will then stop, interrogate those changes, open it up for questions, and make this as engaging and as interactive as we possibly can. So the idea is please do use the chat box on the bottom of the page to ask questions. We'll come back to you at the end of the section and we'll go from there. So I'm going to ask Heidi, she's already got the slides up, it's looking good, to take the page. And together with Alistair, they'll take us through the changes. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. And I've never been called August before, so that's a great introduction.
Pleasure.
Okay. Alistair's going to kick us off actually with a bit of an overview of what's coming in the employment law world.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Heidi. Pleasure to be talking to you all today. Heidi, can I just get you to flick back to the previous slide for me? So apologies. So we are in for the biggest changes to employment law and HR practice in the last 15 years. The Labour government have hit us with numerous unending changes that are coming and are all due to land between now and 2026. Now, it would be impossible for us to cover every single change here, but we've listed them on the slide. And the bold ones are the ones we're going to be talking about today. The unfair dismissal of the day one right, which is the headline grabber. Flexible working, which is going to hit every business, and we think the agency community in particular. And sexual harassment, which is already with us. But just to highlight a couple of others for you. Fire and rehire, that's going to stop you changing contracts as easily as you perhaps wanted to. The rise of the trade union movement, which some people will suck in and go, oh my goodness me, we don't want to be dealing with that. And the idea of a single status of worker as well is going to be interesting. So we're in for a huge change on something which has been relatively static for the last 15 years. So there's an awful lot to watch. There's an awful lot of information to come. And this is really a headline session for you today. So should we flick into the first one, Heidi? So this is one which has caught the headlines. It was the press grabber in the manifestos in relation to the change to the law on unfair dismissal. Now, as the law currently stands, employees have to have 2 years' service to claim an ordinary unfair dismissal right claim, whereas the plan is for that to go entirely. So the principle which the Labour went to the polls on was that fundamentally, from day one, the very first moment that an employee touches your workspace, they will have the right to claim unfair dismissal. Now, lots of businesses sucked in and went, oh my goodness me, we can't possibly do that. And they've now reduced it down to being into an initial period of employment. And that initial period of employment is currently in consultation. Currently, so there's going to be a transition over a 2-year period, but the plan will be that there'll be a 9-month initial period of employment where theoretically an employer can still fairly terminate employment. There will still be processes that have to be followed. There'll still be things to think about, and there'll still be plenty of HR policy and procedure to update. And key here will be contracts updating as well. And this is one where you're going to have to look at it and look at it very carefully in relation to the people that you're bringing in, and are they right? Stephen, questions?
So first question for me is, if an employer brings on a new employee and they're on a 3-month review, that presumably is still illegal. And as you say, it's 9 months in now, and it could have been from day one. But actually having a 3-month review of their performance and deciding whether they're right for the company, is that still going to be something that we can do?
Heidi, do you want to take that one? I think that's more of a question for you as an HR person, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. At the moment, you can have a probation period, which I think is what you're referring to there, Stephen, that some are 3 months, some companies have 6-month probation reviews already in place. And as Alistair says, we're going to have the maximum, we think it's likely to be a maximum of 9 months. At the moment, probation isn't a legal right. It's something that's set out in contracts and in policies, but it does make that review process easier for us to then exit someone if we've made the wrong hire, or likewise the individual decides the role's not right for them. What we think the change is going to be here is that you're going to have more robust processes during those reviews. So we quite often find people come to us on the last day of someone's probation and say, oh no, they're just not good enough, they're just not right. And we say, well, what reviews have you had? What conversation have you had? Where are the notes? And people say, oh no, we haven't spoken to them, we've waited till today. And I think that we're going to have to be much more robust in our approach. So we're talking to managers right now about training out on probation period reviews. So doing regular reviews, making sure you've got really good objectives set from day one, what we're going to be looking for at the 3-month point, at the 6-month point, at the 9-month point, and having really regular reviews, not leaving it until the last day, because that's unlikely to meet your obligations in the future.
Just to build on that, Heidi, I think also evidence is going to be key.
Yeah,
there's an awful lot now in relation to these changes about management decisions being evidenced and making sure that there is evidence associated to what has been done. So if you're going to have an initial period of employment, you're going to have a process, you're going to have to follow that process, you're going to have to evidence the failings, or else we're going to be in a world where it's much harder.
Okay. And I can see how that, for established positions within companies where somebody's coming into the organization, there's a well-defined job description, you've hired them for specific skill sets, and you're going to review them during that 3-month or 6-month probation period. For new to work employees, so people coming either straight from university as graduates or apprenticeships, etc., where perhaps the description is more open, because what you're looking there is to work with the individual, to work to their interests and skill sets, and helping to develop them in different ways. Very often the job description can be a bit looser, and it's more difficult perhaps to have that paperwork in hand. Is there any likelihood there'll be more discrepancy depending upon seniority?
I don't think so. I think there's the application will be the same based on whatever seniority the person is. Certainly, I think at the higher seniorities, it will be potentially harder to show whether the person has achieved their aims or not in the initial period of employment. I think with those joining the workforce, they've got the challenge of making sure that they're up and running to the standards required by the business straight away.
Yeah.
Employers are going to have to make some very tough decisions before people even join, and I actually think that this will drive people away from hiring very junior talent, because what you won't want to do is you won't want to hire somebody without any experience at all, with the risk that then they don't perform in the first few months of their employment.
Which is counterintuitive when we've got so many people, in the workplace, particularly young people, who can't get into work or have either been discouraged or have decided not to get. That doesn't sound to be counterproductive.
I would just pick up, Stephen, you said that the work that you're asking people to do might be flexible, and I don't think that has to be a barrier to this. I think that you don't have to have a job description that you anticipate the person doing for their entire life, but I do think it will be about documenting what you're expecting of them in the first 3 months. And then during that 3 months, you'll be having those conversations with them. Maybe their skills lie in a different area or their interests lie in a different area. But as long as you redocument and evidence what you're expecting then of them for the next 3 months, I think you've still got flexibility. None of us has a job description that stays static for our whole lives, especially in smaller organizations. You guys in small companies, we wear lots of hats and we expect that from everybody. So I do think there will still be a degree of flexibility in what we want from people, but standards of performance and standards of achievement, as long as they're clearly outlined at the beginning of the project, for example, could be different every 3 months. It could be a different project in a different field. But as long as the targets and expectations are set out clearly and the person is given enough support to achieve realistic goals, then there still allows that flexibility that you're talking about there, Stephen, I think.
Okay. And to kind of follow on from that is, if obviously they have been there for 9 months and you do get to a point after that 9-month period where for whatever reason you have to go through a process, can you just remind us actually of the process very quickly, and equally too, what the costs are in terms of what you have to do at that point where you're obliged to offer?
That's unfortunately not a simple answer, Stephen. I could spend the next 3 hours talking about that topic, because it depends upon why you're dismissing the person. Redundancy processes will be different from disciplinary processes, which will be different from capability processes. The point being is, once you're after the 9-month period, you're back into the original principles of what is a fair way to dismiss an employee. And if you take capability as our example, that can be a process of setting extensive goals, managing against those goals over several months, and therefore the costs become management time, they become the HR support time, the costs associated with that time, and just the general fallout and general reputational risks that can run alongside those. So we find that often the ordinariest, the most basic of dismissals can sometimes become really quite complicated and quite difficult to manage, and quite almost people fear them, but actually some good, well-structured approach and planning goes a long way.
Yeah, and I would remind us all that, sorry to just jump in there, Stephen, but I'd remind us all that Alistair sees the worst of dismissals. So he only sees them when they get really complex and really difficult. From a practical point of view, actually, people do go through performance improvement plans or PIPs and capability processes fairly regularly without them needing lawyers' involvement.
Absolutely.
As long as, exactly as Alistair just summarised there, as long as you have good process and you follow those processes and your managers know what they're doing, that it doesn't have to be really complex, but there are risks. And I think that's the point here, that the risks are now coming at 9 months instead of 2 years. So that's the big watch out, is that it's going to be much earlier that we have to start the formal processes. Sorry, Alistair, I made you sound
No,
really,
Heidi, don't apologise in the slightest. Your point is very valid. I see the worst of the world, and I see it where it's gone completely wrong, and we're scratching our chins trying to work out how we fix it. But
yeah, and I see it much earlier than that from a HR perspective. We're involved in hopefully avoiding most of those scenarios. So yeah,
I think Heidi just apologised to a lawyer though. That's the first time.
I'm after a discount, Stephen. I'm after a discount.
Can we bring Peter in, because obviously there are implications for a recruiter in terms of how recruiters can help in this process to ensure that actually there is real clarity on roles, real clarity on actually what is expected of a new employee. Peter.
Yeah. So because we work with quite a lot of SMEs, startups and agencies, a lot of businesses probably haven't set out those sort of specific requirements from the start. So yes, job description, but we sometimes hear the term impact statement. So what are they going to impact? What are they going to actually, what are their performance sort of key metrics? What are they going to deliver, depending on the level and what the role is? And we are finding there's a lot more rigor around that across the last sort of 6 to 9 months. So to the point where on some really sort of senior roles, they're involved in setting out what that looks like. So the actual person who's joining is actually part of that process. So there are sort of particular things within the job description, and then things may be tweaked and adjusted before they start as part of that process. And for some roles that we've seen in some exec appointments, some people are actually taking the time to get involved rather than starting on day one sort of officially, taking time to be involved in key meetings, be involved in team sort of meetings before their start. So it's not a 1 to 2 week get used to stuff. They're actually doing it. You know, I had a situation with someone before Christmas accepted a role, starting in sort of March time, but actually had key meetings in Jan and Feb just to sort of get almost started within that mindset, agreed with both parties. So when they do start, it's all set out. So we are seeing more of that. Obviously, we don't see it post they start other than catch-ups, but we are definitely seeing that creep in.
Makes sense. Okay, unless there's any other questions, we'll go on to the second change in the law, if we may. Back to Alistair.
Well, Stephen, so if we just move forward, this is one which hasn't so much grabbed the headlines, but it's one which, particularly in the agency world, we think is going to have quite a monumental impact in terms of the way that the business would have to operate and you have to think. So under the current law, there is the right for an employee to request flexibility. And that could be flexibility in where they work, how they work, the hours they work, the method of work. There's no really clear defined position as what we mean by flexibility. But the idea is that as an employee, I can request flexible working. So I have the right to request flexible working, irrespective of my length of employment. So from day one, I can go and request it. And then the employer has to assess that and can refuse that request. What Labour are proposing and what we've seen in terms of the consultation coming through is that that's all going to be flipped. So the position will now be that there was a flexible working as a default position from the first day of employment. So let's just pause and think about that for a minute. I've just hired this employee. They start on day one. I'm intending them to be in the office from 9 to 5 on Monday to Friday, because that's the job as I understand it to be. But they turn up and say, you know what, I don't really want to do that on day one. I'm going to work from 9 till 3 today. I'll do 2 till 4 tomorrow afternoon. I'll work from my mum's back bedroom on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's the principle of what the law is saying. It would be a default position that the employee could work flexibly how they can. Now, practically, that is clearly not going to work in some industries. So let's take an example of leisure and hospitality. You're not going to turn up to a public house or a restaurant where everybody's working flexibly because they're not going to be there. But what a business will need to do is they will need to effectively assess in advance whether they can accommodate flexible working or not. They can still refuse to accommodate flexible working if they have one of the 8 grounds and the refusal is reasonable. But you've got to do it beforehand, not afterwards, because if you don't do it first, you're into that horrifying situation, which I just described there, of the employee turning up on day one and then ending up in a situation you've got them, they're working flexibly. And as we say on the slide there are caps and fines there in relation to potentially breaching these arrangements. But for me, that's worrying, but it's not as worrying as the potential of the impact that it could have on the operation of a business, particularly, which we've already talked about, Stephen, in the context of younger or different demographic groups of people who have different expectations of the workplace and what that means and what we as employers will require them to do to meet the demands of the role. I think that's a good place for me to pause.
Ooh, if I can jump in, I think it's a really good place for Peter to jump in, actually, because I think this is such a big conversation between employers and recruiters and the candidates before they start about how this is going to look?
Yeah, so historically, I would say, I don't want to mention COVID, but pre-COVID, it was we always discussed it to a level, but now it is probably one of within the top 3 or 4 questions that are asked of candidates and also employers. So we are very clear and concise on not just only timing, but what it would look like for the first 3 to 6 months, and then for the first sort of 9 to 12, and then what it may be perceived to look like sort of post that. Because I think people do sometimes have, I suppose, a thought that actually the first 3 to 6 months are going to be the same as the rest of the period of time. It's probably not. As in some cases, quite senior roles, you need to be in 5 days a week to actually embed, what is required. So it is a conversation that is strictly had, right at the start. But I must admit, we haven't had any situations like that, other than one where an actual role changed during the interview process. So they had to randomly have shift work for a comms and a media role based on what had changed with the current contracts and the size of business. So they actually fundamentally changed the hours of the role and what was flexible and what was not. So they had to restart the whole campaign again because every candidate in the process was not privy to that. But other than that, it's something that we've not come across yet, but I'm sure it will be a question fired across us, in the coming months, I assume. Yeah.
It'll be for employers to really make sure that they set out clearly what they require in the role and why. I think there's we I'm sure you guys do too. We see businesses say we have to have this, and we have to have this, but they don't know why. They're stuck in their way almost. They haven't really done the analysis of themselves as a business. And it may be that they need to apply different standards to different roles, to different groups of people. And again, they need to be able to explain why. So somebody who is very senior, for example, you may need a different level of flexibility compared to somebody who's very junior. And it just needs some thought process. And I think the tricky part will be each of those different facets of flexibility, because flexibility is not defined in the legislation at all about what we mean about flexible, but it's about places, it's about hours, it's about methods, and each of those factors has to be considered quite carefully. It comes down to what you've already talked about, Peter, in terms of actually those engagements with candidates very, very early.
Yeah, I must admit the younger sort of generation entering the employment at a more junior level, or even sort of 3 or 4 years in, the expectation is very much already what is now the law. There is flexibility, full stop. It's not even a question that is asked really, because they just assume that is the case.
Okay, so this one's a big one for me. Insofar as it's pretty clear when you're advertising a role and you're up front and you're having those conversations with candidates. For me, that's, expectation on both parties' side, clear explanation as to what the role is and what flexibility the employer can offer. However, existing employers, or employees rather, who've been working in an organisation for, say, 5 years or more, who've grown through that COVID period, it's less clear now. And you've got WPP, and it's been well advertised and well publicised in the last few weeks, of 111,000 employees worldwide have demanded that their employees globally get back into the office a minimum of 4 days a week. The pushback on that there's been a pushback from the employees within WPP who've all signed. I think 15,000 of them have all signed up to basically push back on this. And so far, WPP haven't commented. So there is clearly going to be a clash of expectations, and there's a cultural issue too there to be addressed. So what's the rules for existing employees who have got used to working in a certain way to now demand changes in that working methodology?
Who wants to take that one?
That's yours, Alistair.
Not mine. Thanks very much. So I think as an aside, Stephen, we see this in lots of different businesses at this point in time. And I think the number we've seen have increased again in terms of those demanding returns to work, particularly in the economic climate that we currently find ourselves in. So this is not unusual to the agency market. It's very common across various different sectors that businesses are now saying you have to be in more regularly and demanding it. And the starting position is what's the contractual stance. So what is the employee's contractual place of work? Now, I don't want to get into a huge discussion about custom and practice and how custom and practice can amend, but generally the express contractual terms will prevail compared to a custom and practice position. What the employer has to think about, though, is the impact or the potential indirect impact on people who are providing care needs or disability-based reasonable adjustments requirements in terms of placing a demand on an employee which they then cannot meet, and how that could result in a discrimination claim. But an employer doing this has to do it really quite carefully, because they could end up on the list of mass resignations. They could end up on the list of disgruntled employees. And if PP are going to have 11,000 or 15,000 disgruntled employees, they're not going to be exactly pleased about that. It impacts your employee engagement hugely, and there's going to have to be the legal aspect is only a very infinitesimal part of it, because it's the impact on the broader organization, and is that really the culture you want to create? Perhaps you can comment on the cultural side, Heidi.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a slightly different question to the slide, Stephen, but it's all relevant to flexible working, and we've seen since COVID and people, the mismatch of expectation between where people are working, in particular this question. And we've seen a number of companies pushing very hard to get people back into the office. There being then difficulties, challenges, as Alistair said, about from individuals' perspectives, but also more broadly that the culture, that the environment has been really difficult and people are very unhappy. And when you've got unhappy, disengaged employees, they tend to be less productive. So our advice is always to people, going back to Alistair's point earlier about why do you need them back in the office? What is the actual value, and how can you share that reasoning with people in a way that actually resonates for them, that says that they can buy into? Why do they need to be there? If they're saying, I've been working from home, well, I was going to say for 4 years, it's almost 5 years since our first lockdown where we all went home on that Friday afternoon. If they've been doing it successfully in their view since then, from their point of view, why would be forcing them back? What's the value for them? And then the kind of position is that everyone has the right to make a flexible working request. So being pushed to go back now, you can find, and we've come across this, where companies have said, right, that's it, we're going to have 3 days a week back in the office. And then 100 people put in a flexible working request to say, well, I don't want to do those 3 particular days because I've got caring responsibilities, or I've got other things on, so I'm just going to put a flexible working request in. And you actually then creating a real minefield of paperwork for all of your managers to be dealing with. So our advice from a cultural perspective would be to be doing that in a much gentler way, in a much more collaborative way, by talking through consultation with the teams, with individuals, before you put blanket statements out about bringing people back to the office. So that was a slight aside, but hopefully that answers a little bit about thinking.
That's really helpful. Really helpful. I mean, in this particular case, as I understand it, an edict went out from headquarters just off Berkeley Square to WPP worldwide. Many of the chief executives and MDs of the individual businesses were completely unaware of the edict, and then had to obviously deal with disgruntled employees at a local level, and had no references or no terms or whatever to actually agree. Now, in their defense, and this is quite interesting, is that they are looking to cut their workforce by 10%. Now, whether there is interesting enough, the 15,000 people who put their grievances into writing, whether there is a correlation between those 15,000 people and the people who will be redundant in the very near future will be interesting. I also think, one of the things that came out of a webinar we did before Christmas is that there is a strong correlation between agency performance, financial performance, and the number of days that employees are working in the office. Now, employees may not see that, but actually, unless agencies improve their performance, and it's been a very tough 2-year period for agencies, then there will be no jobs. So it is something that need to consult on. Totally agree on that. And I don't have a firm. I'm not in either camp. I think you have to do what's right for the business and right for the employees, and you have to. Unfortunately, I work in small organisations where we have a very fluid communications, and we've always been, as it happens, virtual. So all our teams have always worked more or less from their place of home throughout the last 20 years. However, I also do believe, there's a real value in having people working and learning from each other and collaborating and being in the office, particularly if they're young. And I think they learn from each other. But we're not going to end this conversation now, are we? This one's going to run and run.
No, and Stephen, if I can just jump in, we are a predominantly office-based environment, and the key thing is we had to persuade our people why that was important. And it was important to us in terms of collaboration and learning and development. And actually, we now have a workforce who understand that, because we actively invest in them in terms of their learning, their development, their supervision, and therefore we drive quality as a consequence. So
it's about communication of those messages. You said there we had to convince them. It's about the communication. I think that would be our absolute key driver, is don't just jump 2 feet first into any conversation. In particular, the way you've just outlined there, Stephen, that's really bad practice. Obviously, that the managers weren't briefed in, and there wasn't a cohesive, clear program of why we were going out and doing this. So in any change program, communication is absolutely key. So
there's also an irony. If you have a look at WPP's value set, it's about, I think the three words, as I recall, are collaboration, openness, and I think the third one is support or something of that nature. But it's clearly counter.
So that's a really great example of values being written on a wall but not being lived or breathed in an organisation.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's move on, because this one is a week in itself, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about the next one. So we're going to talk about the new duty in relation to preventing sexual harassment, and this is already law. So if you haven't heard about this, I'll take some time and either listen to it, go and look up the materials that Heidi and I have already put out. We've got sessions we can share with you which are much more detailed in terms of actually what we're talking about. This is going to be a real snapshot of it. The law as it stands, obviously, you cannot sexually harass each other. Sorry to break it to you, but the law already prevents sexual harassment. What this new law, which came in October, provides is that it puts a positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment, to take active steps to avoid it. Now, this only applies to the law in terms of sexual harassment. It doesn't, for example, apply in racial harassment or sexual orientation harassment. It's only sexual harassment this applies to. What I would say is that we are seeing themes of it applying across the other areas, and those themes are mirrored in what Heidi will talk about in a few moments in relation to reasonable steps. The duty requires employers to take reasonable steps, not all reasonable steps. We've got some really good guidance from the ECHR in relation to what that means. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment. It also extends the obligations away from just preventing sexual harassment in relation to your own employees. It also extends it to third parties. So what are you going to do in terms of preventing third parties from harassing your people? So it's a very, very broad obligation. It's a new one which is here, and it is something which all employers have to look at, whether you're the size of a two-man business or you're the WPPs of the world. Obviously, the scale of what you do will be different, which we'll talk about in a moment. The effect of this, though, is if an employer does not comply with this and does not take steps and is then pursued as a consequence of that, there's huge uplifts in compensation. And the average compensation in relation to this area now, which is uncapped, far exceed £50,000. So if you do 25% of £50,000, you're talking about quite a large scale issue. Don't believe this will never happen to your business. Please don't believe this will never happen to your business. I have got a little bit of gallows humor, so forgive me. We have actually had, once again, our busiest Christmas in relation to sexual harassment issues. So 2024 was our last busiest one. We had 6 different complaints of sexual harassment from different situations, different employers across different social events. This year, we were at 8. Now, that's good business for me in terms of legal advice being given, but you don't want to be paying for this if you can avoid it. You can't stop people sexually harassing each other. Of course you can't, but some sensible action now could save you an awful lot of pain later on down the line. The EHRC does have the power to intervene, but that's going to be quite a rarity. They just don't have the resources to do it, frankly. I think the Welsh Rugby Union Board was the only one real note that they pursued in relation to these issues. But actually, it's something which is going to be more enforced through employee correspondence. So if you just flick on for me, Heidi, thank you. And there's a legal obligation here, but for me, there's also a moral obligation. And I currently have the privilege of acting for a couple of people who are the victims of sexual harassment, and their lives have been destroyed as a consequence of the actions that were taken against them. And it is the hardest situations that we have to manage. And the reality of this situation is these are people, and they are real people that we are dealing with. And it's important that we take steps to look after them. I think you're going to take it from here, aren't you, Heidi?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on that and say that the most recent poll around this data says that 3 in 5 women have experienced harassment, bullying, or abuse at work, and it's just shocking numbers. The change in the legislation, the Worker Protection Act that came in October, was driven really from the #MeToo movement. So what was that, back in 2017, where people were speaking out for the first time ever in their thousands, and the government at the time recognised the volume of the issue here, and spent then from 2017 right through doing a review and survey, and then the law coming in that took effect at the end of October last year, really to say that employers have a responsibility here to prevent sexual harassment. Most of us spend a lot of time at work, and if employers can do their share of reducing sexual harassment happening in society, that will be a big chunk of it being reduced, and therefore less people being impacted. The other thing I'm just going to pick up on here is that although the stats there from that TUC poll are about women's experience in the workplace, actually it's not just women that get sexually harassed in workplaces. It can be all genders, and not just by men. Let's also make that really clear. Sometimes we say the word sexual harassment and people say, oh, well, not all men, or oh, the men in my business wouldn't do that. And let's be really clear that anyone can sexually harass anyone. It's not necessarily a gender-based issue. Alistair, were you going to add anything on that before I move on to the...
No, I think it is just really that call to action now for employers. And I think if you haven't done anything with this, you are behind the curve now, but it is very, very able to catch up. There is lots of stuff which both Heidi and I can talk to you about in terms of how you look at these things, and a little bit of action now could save a lot of pain later, is really what I'd say.
Excellent. Okay, so the Equality and Human Rights Commission have published some detailed guidance, 56 pages, I think, at last count. Alistair, we spent that weekend reading it in detail. Yeah, well, Alistair and I have worked together on this, running a number of webinars and face-to-face sessions on this very topic in the autumn last year, and we had one booked for the Tuesday, I think it was, and the guidance was published on the Friday night. So we both had a really fun weekend making sure we were absolutely up to speed. But in summary,
Heidi, can I jump in before you go through this? Because some very basic and seemingly dull questions, but obviously, this is a huge and very important issue. The first question I've got is there any definition around the word sexual harassment? Is there clarity on what is and what isn't sexual harassment, first of all? Secondly, and you're going to go into basically the development of policies, are there standardized policies that exist to be able to help employers? Because Alice is saying no, there isn't, and the thing is,
no, I'm nodding that yes, I hear your question.
Well, but kind of, because my general suspicions are, we see it, and the reality is what is sexual harassment to one individual may not be to another, and also the recipient versus the person who is dishing it out. Again, the clarity around this particular subject is particularly difficult, or historically has been difficult. And if we have a conversation with somebody who is perhaps younger versus somebody who is of my age, there will be, and I think there's real obvious stuff that is sexual harassment, but there's this dreadful word, again, banter, that has basically been purported to be a catch-all and clearly isn't. So without me jumping both feet into this, I'm really interested to understand different perspectives and understand what is best practice and what policy should be.
Let me take the first one. So yes, there are very clear legal definitions of what we mean by harassment on grounds of sex and sexual harassment. This is unwanted. It's unwanted conduct which has the purpose or effect of humiliating and upsetting or intimidating people, and unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. And the this is very, very well established law about what we mean with these topic spaces. And what we have to remember in this area is this is all looked at from the perspective of the victim. It is never looked at from the perspective of the perpetrator. And I'm thinking of a case which we dealt with over Christmas, where a senior CEO asked to kiss a junior female individual. It's just blinking obvious that it meets the definition, to be frank with you. And I think we have to take a really grown up look at these topics and accept that these are things which are just not tolerable in the workplace any longer. They are not appropriate behavior. And banter, we all have banter in our workplaces, of course we do. But what is appropriate banter and what isn't appropriate is, I think, is much easier for people to define now, and much easier for you to fall foul of if you go off the route. And it's something you've got to be very, very careful with as an employer, because you do end up on the end of some very, very big claims. And Heidi, do you want to take the second part of the question?
No, I was just going to ask you to repeat the quote, Alistair, because I think this is the core piece of this, and Stephen did right to ask us, and we should have had the quote written really clearly out there. So it's unwanted conduct of a sexual nature that has the purpose or effect of making someone feel intimidated, violated, or upset, in effect. So it's purpose or effect is the big point there. So Stephen, that was your part of your question there. Was
it was, because I mean, you could take the word sexual out of that particular phrase, or that particular statement, and actually that would still be a real issue.
So they're slightly separate things, really. So yeah, with the word sexual, of a sexual nature in there, is the definition of sexual harassment. If we took out that phrase and we said it's unwanted conduct related to a protected characteristic that has the purpose or effect of making someone feel violated, then we'd be on the grounds of the much wider issues around harassment related to race, or harassment related to age, or harassment related to, so they're very, very similar. There's not that crossover. There is
it's about respect.
Yeah. So the conversations that we're having with people, Alistair's team and my team are going out to businesses and having conversations and running training sessions with line managers and with members of staff, and we're positioning that very much around dignity at work. This is around respecting your colleagues. This is around respecting each other, and not violating anyone's right to a safe and respectful workplace. Because that's where we get the most productive, happy, engaged employees, and rightfully so. That's what we should be working towards.
And this is a really difficult topic for people to talk about. It's something which we don't like to talk about. It's something which is not a comfortable subject as employers to deal with. But we owe these people who work with us a responsibility to look after them. And that's where this new duty goes. It creates that positive action, and it creates the obligations on employers. And just dipping into the second one, and perhaps you want to take this further, Heidi, is the fact that none of this can be exactly the same between one business and another. Every business will be different. Every organisation across the country will be different. What is relevant in one industry will be different to another industry. So there are no standard policies that you can simply grab and take. You've got to look at everything on an individual basis, and perhaps that gives you the point, Heidi, to go from there onto this other slide here.
Yeah, I think it does. I think this is the guidance from the Employee and Human Rights Commission, EHRC. I can never say the letters in the right order, and you got them wrong earlier as well, Alistair. So acronyms are not ever easy. This is the guidance for employers that says these are the 8 steps every organisation should be taking, no matter, as Alistair said earlier, whether you're a 2-man band or a 200,000 employee. We should all be going through exactly the same process, looking into our business, looking internally at what we do and what risks our team members are at. The steps are brilliant and they're really clear, and I'm going to talk them through really quickly because I'm conscious of the time, but I'm not going to do them in the right order because I think they're written in the wrong order. Please don't start with step 1 by writing a policy. Please start at steps 2 and 3. So look at what's currently happening in your business, assess and look at the risks in your business. Do your members of staff all sit in one open plan office and they only come into contact with 3 other people, members of staff, and it's a very corporate environment? That's quite low risk. Or do you run a business where your teams are out with clients, at hospitality events, at PR events? Is there alcohol being, is it late at night? Are they working alone, as in they're the only one from your organisation there? So those risks are very different. So you've got to look at every single member of your teams and say, where are they at risk of being sexually harassed? And that's where the difference comes, because then once you've got that list of risks where your specific team members might be at risk, you can then look at how can we mitigate the risk? How can we reduce the likelihood of them being sexually harassed in any of those particular scenarios? That's step 3. Step 2, you're talking to your teams and saying, how comfortable are you in the workplace? What's going on for you? Where do you ever feel uncomfortable? Have you ever felt uncomfortable? You might do that through general conversation. You might do that through an engagement survey. If you run those already, you might add some specific questions in. You might say directly, have you ever been sexually harassed in your workplace? Because actually we want to understand what people's real life experience is, so that we can then do everything possible to mitigate that happening again, which is our new duty to prevent this happening. So steps 2 and 3 kind of combine there. Once you've got all that plan, you've got all the risks, you've got all your ideas of how you're going to mitigate the risks, then you can write your policy. So that's the question you asked, Stephen, can we go out and get a standard policy? Well, no, because what I've written for my business and what Alistair's written for his business is going to be very different from what you write for your business, Stephen. So you can't take mine because it won't work, because they're different risks and different mitigating actions. So your policy should be bespoke to your organisation. Top and tail might be similar, that says as an organisation we have zero tolerance for sexual harassment and we want everyone to work in an environment where they feel safe. But what you are doing in your business is the body of it. There's no point just having an off-the-shelf policy that doesn't relate to your business, because it wouldn't be a defence if you end up with a claim against you. So get your policy, get your risk assessment, talk to people, find out what's happening. Make sure you've got step 4 now, make sure you've got really clear reporting lines. So does everyone in the organisation know what to do if they've got any concerns? Who do they talk to? Traditionally, that would have just been one named person in your policy. Your grievance procedure might say, if you've got a concern, go and talk to the head of operations. The recommendation now is that you put a much broader range of reporting options, because what if it's the head of operations that's doing the sexual harassment? So we've got to make sure we've got that breadth of reporting opportunities, and you should consider whether you should have an external telephone helpline, for example, in the way you might have considered that for the whistleblowing regulations some years ago. So what are the range of reporting options? And you can't just tick this and say it's done. Yep, we've written our risk assessment, we've published our policy, and that's it. We never have to look at this again. There is very, very clear guidance that we must be monitoring and evaluating this. This should be live. We should be thinking about this as managers. When we take on new employees, or we take on a new project, or we get a new client and we go for our first ever time to hospitality at Ascot, for example, that should be being built into our risk assessment. When things change, we need to add those risks in. We need to make sure we're mitigating for them again, and we need to then monitor and evaluate, are all the things we're doing that we've said in our policy we're going to do and we are actually doing in real life, are they helping reduce the likelihood and the number of sexual harassment incidences? You might all think, actually, we don't have any sexual harassment incidences in our organisation. And I think we're all really clear that actually you might not have ever had any reported instances of sexual harassment in your organisation. But from those TUC figures, 3 in 5 employees have been sexually harassed. We've probably all got something in our organisation that we may not know about, as much as we don't want to say that, but actually recognising that it's much more common than we would like is the first step to then being able to reduce it. So keep evaluating, is it working? What else can we be doing? Because you've got all of these things that have got to keep going. You've got to keep going with your policy. You've got to keep going with training. You've got to make sure that your managers know what to do when a complaint's made. You've got to know where the risks are coming from to be able to mitigate them, and keep reviewing whether those mitigating circumstances are working.
Okay. All right.
Big
Another
step.
extremely complex area. I do think that, despite what you say, that obviously every policy and every process needs to be unique to your business, because everyone's different. I do think actually there is some value in being able to share examples purely so that people know what other organizations have put in place. Even if it's not right for them, it can be tailored from that, and to get some ideas helpful. Second question from someone on the call. Employee goes to an event, is harassed by someone outside of the employee's business. Where does the risk start and finish?
So if I think about the step 3, sorry, I'll start, Alistair, and then you can finish.
Yeah, you
because
go.
I think
I don't envy you on that question. You go.
No, I was going to take a step back and say, actually, if we know that the employee's going to that event, what did we do beforehand to think that through? So where have we got documented in our risk assessment that we're sending this person out into the wild, and this may be people's jobs and they do it day in, day out, but what have we considered where the risks come from, and have we talked them through preventative measures? So I don't know, maybe it's that they don't go alone. It's maybe that we always send 2 people from our agency to events, or maybe it's that we make it clear the individuals had some, I don't know, some conflict management training, or that they know they're confident, they're told that they're allowed to walk away from a client who might be getting a bit handsy with them. They know it's not about upsetting the client, it's about their own protection first, that we will back them. So have we done all those things before the event, which is where the new duty comes in? And then where does the liability come? I'm going to let you answer that bit, Alistair.
With the liabilities are really not clear cut in that question at all, because you don't know where the event's taking place. You don't know for the purpose of the event. You don't know the people who are involved. Now, one of them is your employee. Now, if it's a definite workplace event and this is a third party who's attending it, you're responsible for your employee, and theoretically you're liable in that situation. But let's say it's a general networking event which you've got no control over. That's going to be much harder for the employee to say that you are culpable and responsible of it. But then let's say the person who's doing the harassment is one of your employees as well, then you're immediately back into the responsibility for it. So it's a very tricky question to answer, Stephen. It's a very fact-specific one that you'd have to look at very carefully.
Yeah.
But in general, the overview is, as an employer, you have a duty to make sure you've done everything possible to prevent sexual harassment happening. And then if it does happen, the liability is, there's a high risk it comes back to you as the employer.
Absolutely.
It seems to me that kind of fewer and fewer agencies are having Christmas parties, fewer are having bars in the office, which used to be very popular, for this very reason, because they open themselves up to potential risk. Okay, lots to think about there. So apparently you can't hear me. I'm leaning in. Can you hear me now? No? You can hear me now. Okay, cool.
We can,
Let's
yeah.
move on to, I think that was the last one, and we've got one more. I can't remember now.
No, that's it. That's all the formal plans we had to cover, Stephen, for you today, yeah.
Oh, what a minefield. Listen, it's very interesting to me, if you could take that slide off. We're at a time where technology is beginning to creep into the workplace, AI in particular, and beginning to erode job security in some industries. In the marketing world, it's having a huge impact, where we've got bots, technology, etc., that now create content, that create videography, that can create PR content and develop and execute on your behalf, can write code, etc., etc. I'm assuming currently it's not possible for a bot to be able to claim they've been sexually harassed. Likewise, it wouldn't be possible for an AI component to be able to actually claim unfair dismissal after 3 months in the job. This really, for me, accelerates a move for employers moving towards using technology in a more meaningful way. That coupled obviously with changes in national insurance and minimum wage, etc. This is ultimately designed to actually help employees. Ultimately, however, I suspect it's going to have a counter effect. That's a massive conversation. We're going to have another 2 hours on this one, and it'd be a lovely debate to have. But we want growth, and we want growth in the economy any way we can. Agencies after 2 years are desperate for growth, and that's why, as our clients that we work with, human rights are incredibly important. But at the same time, balancing that with the opportunities for growth and not exporting jobs or using technology to supplant opportunity is something that's also very important. I'm going to leave it there because there are no answers to that debate beyond the fact that I think we'll have to come back across and have a conversation around that. It's been really, really interesting, and I'd like to thank you all for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And for those that attended today's call, and hopefully you can get in place your own sexual harassment policy and help to train people. Seems to me the most important thing is communication, opening up the dialogue, making everyone aware of what are concerns to them, and vice versa, because we don't all see things the same way. And I think as we look at the generations, we all have different points of view, and you've got to actually engage and actually ask people for their views, and then use that to build the policy, not the other way around. I think is the clear message from today. Other things to say, we've got other events coming up this week. Tomorrow we have the 5 p.m. club. Anybody would like to join that, it's in the chat box there. Please, you're welcome. That is an hour's worth of safe networking, no alcohol involved, and you're all on your screen, so please come along for that. We then have a session on awards coming up in a week's time on the 12th of February. We'll be talking about the importance of agency awards. Again, I can only imagine that more and more award ceremonies are going to be virtual. And then we move on to the first 6 p.m. club of the year on the 27th of February. Interesting one on that. We'll have to have a conversation about that one, Alistair and Heidi, because we provide the environment, we provide the drink and the food, and most of the people who attend are members or guests of Pimento. Where does the liability lie in that situation? We'll have to come back to you though. So we're gonna, and I think that's it. So listen, my voice apparently has gone very quiet. My microphone is not working. I will pull it out and hopefully it's better. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon. And thank you once again for your time today.